We'll start with, in some ways, with the end, with the death of Nissim Shamama. So on a Friday morning, January 24th, 1873, so just over 150 years ago, one of the richest men in Italy, probably actually one of the richest men in Europe at the time, woke up with a bad stomachache. A few hours later, he was dead. This man was Nissim Shamama. He had been born in Tunisia, which at the time was a province of the Ottoman Empire, but largely autonomous and under the rule of the Bey of Tunis, who technically was an Ottoman governor, but essentially sort of ran things as he wished. So you can imagine that somebody who was very wealthy, and especially somebody who never had children of his own, people and who died suddenly, right? Everybody wanted to know what was going to happen to all of his money. So as soon as Nissim had died, a search for his will began. And the Italian, so he died in Livorno, which at the time, which I imagine is familiar to many of you, being such an important hub in Sephardic history, especially in the early modern period, but even into the 19th century, I would argue. And Livorno was a place with very strong connections to Tunisia, as we'll talk about later. Nissim's house was full of police officers that had been sent from the Livornese police, and it also housed his sort of adopted daughter. As I said, he never had biological children, but he had a great niece, a woman named Aziza, who from a very young age had come to live with Nissim already back when they lived in Tunis. So on the left here, you see a picture of Aziza shortly after about 4 years after they'd left Tunis, and they had moved to Paris, and that's her husband, Moise or Moise or Moshe, and their little son, who was named nothing less than Nissim. And as you know, of course, Sephardic Jews have the custom of naming their children after usually the grandfather, usually the paternal grandfather, and unlike Ashkenazim, it doesn't matter if the person is living or not, right? But Aziza did not name the child after either the paternal grandfather or the maternal grandfather. She was estranged from her father, and had sort of already, before she married and became a mother, she had already gone to live in her great uncle's house. So she named her child after our Nissim Shamama, after this guy. I call him Nissim Jr., just to differentiate. And here you see he's very cute. He's about 4 years old. He's dressed up in European clothes, but his mother is still wearing sort of more traditional Tunisian dress. And then on the right here, this is a much, much later photo. We don't know exactly when it's from, but certainly after Nissim Shamama died, when Aziza was an older lady, and she's looking very bourgeois somewhere in some park, possibly in Paris, though it also could have been in Marseille. In any case, I'll show you a little bit of the family tree to give you a sense of the relationship. So here is our Nissim, and he never had children, but he had nephews, Solomon or Shlomo, whose nickname was Mumu. And Mumu's first wife, Esther, from whom he was estranged, that produced Aziza, right? But then he divorced Aziza's mother, and Aziza sort of never really felt close to her father. And then you can see, we'll talk about the other relatives in a second. So after a long search, sort of towards the afternoon, just before Shabbat was coming in, they finally found 5 copies of a will that was handwritten by Nissim himself in Judeo-Arabic. They discovered that the will divided the estate in half. Half went to Aziza and her son, Nissim Jr., and half went to 2 of Nissim Sr.'s 3 living male relatives. So Shlomo was alive, Joseph was alive, and Nathan was alive. At this point, all of his brothers had died, and his other Kamuna and Masauda were female relatives, nieces, but according to Jewish law, right, if there are male relatives, then the female relatives don't get any part of the inheritance. So the closest three living male relatives were these three nephews, Shlomo, Joseph, and Nathan. The will, however, almost cut out Shlomo completely and instead gave a good part of the fortune to Aziza and Nissim, who, according to traditional Jewish law, wouldn't have gotten anything because according to traditional Jewish law, there is no formal adoption. There's no such thing as formal adoption. And Aziza, as a kind of distant niece, would have had no rights to any of Nissim's fortune. As you can imagine, however, the various members of the Shamama family, both Aziza and Nissim, but also Shlomo, Mumu, Kayed Mumu, Joseph or Yosef, and Nathan or Natan, all three of whom were living in Tunis at the time, right? They didn't just hear the news of the will and then say, oh, okay, that's what he wanted, right? Good, we accept it, right? That's not usually the way it goes with contested inheritance and family stories. And so it probably doesn't take much imagination to predict the next step, which was a lawsuit. Very soon, within days of Nissim dying, all of the major players had sent powers of attorney to various lawyers in Livorno to make sure that their interests were represented. And I would say that probably, in addition to death and taxes, right, fighting over an estate is probably about as certain when the estate is large, right, especially as large as Nissim's. Now, we need to understand a little bit about Italian law before we understand how everybody was going to go about deciding whether the will was kosher or not according to Italian law and how the state was going to get distributed. So we'll turn to this man, who turns out to be a very important player in the Shamama case. Pasquale Stanislao Mancini was one of the most important Italian lawyers of the late 19th century, and indeed probably one of the most important sort of, well, for professors anyway, among the professors, he was definitely one of the most important thinkers of the Risorgimento, the movement of Italian unification. And he came up with something called the nationality principle. But let's talk a little bit about Mancini's background because it will help you understand what the nationality principle was and why it mattered. Mancini started out as a lawyer in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the south, not far from Naples. But soon he had kind of caught on to this idea of nationalism, the idea that all people speaking Italian or reading Dante, essentially, all over the Italian peninsula, even though they were living in all of these different states, right? The Jews in Livorno were under the Duchy of Tuscany, and the Jews in Rome were living under the Pope. The Pope was the head of the Papal States, et cetera, et cetera. He believed that all of these states should unify and become one single country. And he put the ideas of nationalism into his work as a lawyer and into his theorizations about this new field of law that people were just starting to call international law. So there's a sort of early modern precursor to international law, which is usually called the law of nations. But modern international law actually is often dated to the very year of Nissim Shamama's death, 1873, because that's the year that the Institut du Droit International, the Institute of International Law, was founded, which is the first professional organization of international lawyers and jurists. And none other than Pasquale Stanislao Mancini was elected as its first president. So Mancini basically he was a huge nationalist, and he came to his fame through putting together his belief in nationalism, with his understanding of international law, and that came to be the nationality principle. Essentially, the idea was that private law, marriage, divorce, child custody, inheritance, obviously very important for us, all of these aspects of private life, right, should follow the national law of a person, even when they were outside of their country. That's the nationality principle. So and it comes from this idea that national law is just as important as nationality. So in the same way that we believe that nationalities should have their own states, right? National law should be respected wherever a person might go. So if an Italian happens to die in France, he shouldn't have the injustice of French law being applied to his estate, because that is a kind of disrespect of his nationality, which is a core part of his being, right? Instead, national law should follow people wherever they go. And similarly, when foreigners are in Italy, their national law should be respected. Now, Mancini became very famous for this idea and many others. He was appointed the first chair of international law under the new state of Sardinia, which became sort of the core of Italy after 1848. And in the early 1860s, when the new government started to draft the first Italian civil code, they asked Mancini to write the introduction, basically the kind of, the law, the sort of outline of private international law as it should apply in Italy, and he wrote his nationality principle into the Italian civil code. This all meant that when Nissim Shamama died in 1873, which was about 8 years after the civil code went into force for the first time, Mancini's nationality code was the letter of the law and decided which law would apply to Nissim's estate. So if Nissim had died an Italian national, which everybody thought he was when he died, because Nissim Shamama had fled Tunis in 1864. He had moved to Paris with Aziza, and while living in Paris, he had asked for naturalization as an Italian citizen. He had gotten a special degree from the King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele II. He had also purchased a royal title. He became Conte Shamama. And so just to go back to the very first slide, right, that's his coat of arms. That was approved by the Ministry of the Interior back when he became an Italian. And then he moved to Italy, not right away, not immediately upon getting Italian citizenship, but a few years later. When he moved, he declared Livorno as his domicile, and he declared himself to be Italian citizen, and everybody just assumed that that was the case. So everybody thought, okay, nationality principle means Nissim Shamama is an Italian, so Italian law will apply to his estate. Now, if Italian law were to apply, there was no question that Nissim's will would be considered valid. Nissim had written a will without actually the aid of notaries, but he had done so in France. And according to Italian law, you respected the law of the land where the will was written, and France unequivocally accepted basically what are called holographic wills, wills that you write yourself. So there was no question that Nissim's will would be valid. Aziza would get her money, which, by the way, I can't remember if I mentioned, but the sum of Nissim's estate was enormous. They didn't know right when he died just how much he was worth. It took many, many years of inventorying all of his. He made much of it. He had real estate, he had jewels, but much of his property was in stocks and bonds, essentially. He had invested in stocks and bonds really all over the world. And by the time they figured it out, they realized that his estate amounted to 27 million francs. It's hard to know what 27 million francs bought you in 1873, but to give you a sense of just how astronomical a sum that was, the Rothschild, the branch of the Rothschild, I'm forgetting his first name, who died in Paris just a few years before Nissim, was worth about 60 million francs. So, significantly more, about twice Nissim, but he was a Rothschild. So Nissim was in the 0.1% of the wealthiest people in Europe, right? That for sure we know. Okay. So Aziza says, okay, good. Nissim, as long as we can prove that Nissim died an Italian, that that he had become a citizen and that was all good, then I will get my millions. So of course she knows there's a lawsuit coming, and whom does she hire to represent her? None other than Pasquale Stanislao Mancini. Who better to prove that Nissim was an Italian than the man who had written the relevant part of the Italian Civil Code? However, of course, it wasn't that simple. There wasn't just one side of the story. And very soon after Nissim's death, various people started digging around Nissim's past, and they discovered that even though Nissim had gotten this degree of naturalization from the King of Italy, back when he was living in Paris, they found that the decree required its bearer to register himself as an Italian citizen, either with an authority in Italy or with the nearest Italian consulate, and to take an oath of loyalty to the king, both within 6 months of receiving this decree, neither of which Nissim Shamama ever did. He never registered his naturalization decree. He didn't come to Italy until 5 years after becoming naturalized, and he never took an oath of loyalty. So suddenly, the question of whether Nissim Shamama had become Italian did not seem quite so obvious to everybody. Now, you can imagine that some people probably thought this was good news, and in particular, this man, Shlomo, or Mumu, Qaid Mumu, because he was also a kind of official in the Tunisian government. Mumu was very interested in the possibility that Nissim Shamama had not become Italian and had remained Tunisian. And let me explain why. Tunisian Jews at the time were under Jewish law for matters of marriage, divorce, inheritance, basically what we call private law, right? There was no question that Jewish law would have applied had Nissim Shamama died a Tunisian Jew in Tunisia, right? A subject of the Bey of Tunis, there's no question. So if Nissim Shamama was still Tunisian, right, if he had not become Italian because he didn't do all of those formal bureaucratic things that he was supposed to do, then Nissim Shamama would have his estate adjudicated according to Tunisian law, right? Again, the nationality principle that's at work, right? His national law is Tunisian law, and Tunisian law in this case is Jewish law. And if if his estate gets adjudicated according to Jewish law, then the will almost certainly gets thrown out, because the will is not, basically all of the obvious requirements of a kosher will are missing from this will. Most notably the formal transference of ownership according to Jewish law. So if the will is thrown out and just regular Jewish inheritance law is applied, then the estate gets divided up among the 3 living closest male relatives, Joseph, Nathan, and Shlomo. Now remember, in the will, Joseph and Nathan each get a quarter. Aziza and her son get half. Shlomo gets almost nothing. He does get 25,000 francs, but, compared to a third, which would be 9 million, that's a lot less. So Shlomo is the kind of main protagonist behind the idea that Nissim Shamama died a Tunisian. However, of course, I'm trying to simplify things a little bit for you. In fact, in the course of the lawsuit, which took over a decade to resolve, many, many lawyers, millions and millions of francs or lire or whatever currency you want to count in, there were 2 other possibilities of what Nissim Shamama's citizenship might have been, right? Obviously, he could have been Tunisian, he could have been Italian. A third possibility was that he was stateless when he died, that he had lost his Tunisian citizenship, but he had not become an Italian, so he was stateless. And then the fourth possibility was that as a Jew, Judaism was his nationality. The Jewishness was a national law. Jewish law was a national law. And so if Nissim Shamama was Jewish, then one didn't need to really figure out whether he was Tunisian or Italian, because Jewishness was his nationality. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the different possibilities in depth. So today I'll just be talking a little bit about some of the debates over whether Nissim was Tunisian, to kind of give you a sense of what sorts of questions this case raised for identifying Jews, right? Who were these Sephardic Jews going across the Mediterranean? So I'll take a pause before I get back to the story and just think a little bit about some of the big questions that the Shamama case raises, right? Of course, I think it's a very interesting case in and of itself, because it kind of, Nissim Shamama is not particularly well known. He's a little bit known to Tunisian Jewish historians. He's a little bit known to Tunisian historians of the 19th century. He was a government official before he left Tunis. He became very close to the highest echelons of power, right? The Bey, the kind of ruler of Tunis, his right-hand man, the Grand Vizier, Mustafa Khaznadar, was Nissim Shamama's patron. So he was very, very much in the inner circles of power. And for that alone, he's well known. But nobody has really written much about him, in part because I think for Tunisian Jews, it's a little bit embarrassing, largely because Nissim Shamama was suspected of having made off with lots of money, or accused of having made off with a lot of money belonging to the Tunisian treasury. This is not something I was ever able to confirm or deny. Um, we can get into this in the Q&A if you're interested, but he's kind of a disgraced figure in Tunisian history and national memory. And for Tunisian nationalist historians, there's a kind of, sort of like, oh, yes, this Jew who got very powerful and then ran off with our money, and that's about the end of the interest. But I'm interested in the story, of course, also because I think that his trajectory is very interesting. I think his family is very interesting. And I think it raises all of these fascinating questions about nationality, right? And helps us think about nationality in the age of nationalism, right? We know a lot about nationalism. Everybody knows that nationalism was this important ideological sort of tool that swept the world, that reshaped the globe, that changed maps and borders, etc. But what we often don't know is what this what the kind of day-to-day effect this had on people, and especially on people in their attempts to interact with legal institutions. And I think Jews, as is so often the case, are particularly useful to think with about nationality because they never quite fit, right? Of course, we know about Zionism as a Jewish sort of embrace of nationalist thinking. But first of all, we have to remember that Zionism really only gets started as an organized movement more than 2 decades after Nissim Shamama's death. There are sort of precursors. There are people who are starting to think in kind of pre-Zionist terms. But Herzl doesn't come up with his vision for Zionism until the 1890s, right? Um, and I think one of the things that this case makes us think about is the ways in which Jews are perceived as a nation and even perceive themselves as a nation well before Zionism is really on the map. I also think that Jews help us think about citizenship in a way that isn't as centered in Europe and that really takes a more Mediterranean approach, right? And in part that's because Jews didn't quite fit into these new ideas of nation states either in Europe or in North Africa. So they help us kind of break down these imagined barriers between East and West. And one of the things that made me really interested in the Nissim Shamama story was precisely that it's a legal case that's taking place across the Mediterranean, right? It's Italian courts that are ultimately ruling about where Nissim Shamama's estate will go, but they're consulting with Tunisians. They're consulting with Tunisian government officials. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. They're consulting, rabbis are involved, right? Rabbis from all over the Mediterranean write legal opinions to Shuvot concerning Nissim Shamama's will, and rabbis and Jewish professors from Livorno also get involved in talking about what they think Jewish law has to say about the subject. So it's this very kind of, in some ways it's a very modern case, and in other ways it's sort of drawing on these much older forms of expertise, and forms of expertise that really cross political and religious boundaries. Okay, I think with that, let's get a little bit into the case to make sure we have some time to talk about specifics. Um, uh, so I'm going to focus today on the arguments around Nissim Shamama being a Tunisian or not, right? And I have to introduce you to a new character whom we haven't met yet, a man named Hussein ibn Abdallah. So I mentioned the kind of presence of Tunisian government officials. Okay, so remember that Qaid Momo is kind of the main motivator behind the argument that Nissim Shamama died as a Tunisian, because he's the one who stands to get far more money if the will is thrown out and Jewish law is applied to the estate. And behind Momo is the weight of the entire Tunisian government. This is because, as I mentioned, right, Nissim had progressively fell out of favor with the Tunisian government after leaving Tunisia, and by the time of his death, Tunisian government officials were accusing him of owing really vast sums to the treasury, of having embezzled really large amounts of money. However, normally, right, if somebody, including a government, says that an estate owes a lot of money, they would just go to the courts and say, here are the ledger books, right? Here is it said where Nissim Shamama owed us money. So please take this money out of the estate and pay us back. But no matter what they did, the Tunisian government officials could not find adequate proof of the debts that they claimed Nissim owed. Did this mean that Nissim Shamama was innocent and they were just accusing him falsely? Possibly. Did this just mean that the Tunisian government was incredibly disorganized and didn't really have a very good filing system? Almost certainly. It's not, I don't think it's conclusive proof either way, but in any case, what they realized is that they were going to have to go through a back door. If they wanted to get some of the money that they said Nissim Shamama owed him, they were going to have to do something a little bit different instead of just going to the Italian court. So what they did is they went to Qaid Mumu, who by this point had also taken a job with the Tunisian government. They said, Qaid Mumu, wouldn't you like to sign an agreement saying that when you get your share of the inheritance, you'll give a quarter of it to the government, and after that, we won't bother you for any of your uncle's debts. We'll be, quit. We promise not to ask for anything more. Mumu probably did not want to sign this document, but he had no choice, so he was forced to sign it. The government then, by the way, tried to do the same thing with Joseph and Nathan, and Joseph and Nathan had this there's this very dramatic account, actually in one of the Teshuvot about the case, which says that Joseph and Nathan are called to the palace of the Bey, Erev Shabbat, it's just before Shabbat, and they're told that they have to sign this thing, and they say, well, we can't sign it on Shabbat. And they say, okay, fine, go home. And instead of going home, they go to the Italian consulate and they break into the consulate at night. And in the morning, the Italian consul wakes up and there's these two Jews who are there, along with another niece who is being forced to marry Qaid Mumu. She doesn't want to marry him. She wants to marry her childhood sweetheart, another Shamama, but the family is trying to force her to marry Qaid Mumu. So they say to the Italian consul, please protect us. The Bey is trying to make us sign this unfavorable agreement. And the Italian consul says, yes, you can stay in my consulate and be under my temporary protection, and refuses to let the Bey see them and refuses to make them sign anything. Basically, hustles them out of Tunis and they get on a boat to Livorno without signing anything. But Mumu has signed this agreement. And that's actually enough for the purposes of the Tunisian government, because the Tunisian government only needed one of the potential heirs, and that makes them a party to the case. So now they can go to Livorno and they can plead in the case as a directly interested party, right? So they send this guy, Hussein ibn Abdallah, who already actually has been living a lot in Tuscany, who already has been responsible for pursuing various legal cases that the government claims that the government has pending before the courts in Italy. And Hussein is basically takes responsibility for being kind of the Tunisian government's man on the ground. Now, he knows also that he needs to have a fancy lawyer, right? Of course, Mancini is on the other side of the case, right? So he hires basically the second most famous international lawyer in Italy at the time, this man, Augusto Pierantoni, who had been Mancini's student in his younger years, who had fallen in love with and married Mancini's daughter, Grazia, and who had become a partner in Mancini's law firm. They often pleaded cases together. But this was, as far as I know, the first and only time where Augusto Pierantoni and Mancini were on opposite sides of the courtroom. So here you have really the most famous Italian lawyer of international law and the second most famous Italian lawyer of international law, the first one's son-in-law, pleading on opposite sides of the courtroom, one representing this Tunisian woman, Aziza Shamama, right? And the other representing her father, her estranged father, Mumu, and the government of Tunisia through Hussein ibn Abdallah. And here they are all arguing over what is the nationality of this man, Nissim Shamama. Did he die Italian or did he die Tunisian? Now, Pier Antoni and Hussein started out sort of on the wrong foot because by the time they got their legal team together, there had already been an argument made that Nissim Shamama, not only had he died Italian, but in fact, he had never been Tunisian. He had never been a Tunisian national. And that was precisely because he was a Jew. According to this argument, right, there to be a national you had to have civil and political rights, and Jews in the Islamic world were dhimmis, right? They were sort of um, not equal subjects with Muslims, and thus they couldn't be nationals. So this, basically this argument says that because Tunisia doesn't have religious equality, Jews can't really be full nationals. And as you can imagine, Pier Antoni, who was very smart but had never studied Tunisian law or Islamic law or really any law other than European law before, was a bit at a loss. So he turned to Hussein to help him out. And Hussein wrote a detailed response to this argument that Nissim Shamama had never been Tunisian. And in his response, it's interesting. He starts by saying, yes, Tunisia is a religious country and it is governed by religious law. However, he said, according to Islamic law, Jews are full members of the state. They have full belonging. And he writes that in Islamic law, nationality is based on religion for Muslim subjects and on the pact of dhimma for non-Muslim subjects. So the pact of dhimma is the ahd, the dhimma, the agreement from which the term dhimmi comes, which essentially is the agreement that says Jews and Christians and other non-Muslim monotheists are allowed to live under Islamic rule as long as they agree to respect a certain number of rules, to pay certain special taxes, to kind of basically be lower on the social hierarchy. And in exchange for that, they will be allowed to follow their customs and they won't be forced to convert. So what's interesting here is that usually, I would say the vast majority of historians who talk about the status of dhimmi talk about it as a demeaning status, right? As something that was not particularly desirable. But for Hussein, he's actually noting that the status of dhimmi is precisely what gives Jews in Tunisia full access to state membership and thus full access to the status of Tunisian nationals. And I'll say that this is part of a broader effort on the part of a number of North African Muslim intellectuals at the time to ground Tunisian nationality law in Islamic tradition, or to ground nationality law in Islamic tradition, and to rethink the status of Jews more broadly. So I would say that, in some ways, the saying that Jews were nationals is only the beginning, because Hussein goes on to make an even more radical argument and says that the Islamic religion, Islam, accords dhimmis and Muslims the same rights and the same obligations. One could say that that is just patently false, in the sense that dhimmis and Muslims at the very basic level pay different taxes, right? They have different obligations in terms of military service. Traditionally, dhimmis did not perform military service. They definitely have different obligations. And one could also say similarly, they have different rights, because Jews do not have certain rights like building. Technically, they're not allowed to build new synagogues. Technically, they're not allowed to rebuild a synagogue higher or larger than it already was, and even rebuilding a synagogue that had been destroyed is kind of iffy, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that even if one could say, even if one could argue that Hussein is not being 100% honest in this response, it's clear where his argument is coming from, because he is involved in this broader effort to try to counter what is a pervasive assumption among Europeans at the time, that basically Muslims are fanatical and systematically oppress Jews and Christians in the Islamic world. So Hossein ibn Abdallah has actually been engaged in trying to prove that that's not necessarily the case for many decades. So, in an earlier letter that he wrote in 1861, he notes he has this kind of long list of places in Europe where Jews were not then fully emancipated, right? And he says actually Jews in Tunisia are doing very well compared to Jews in Germany, Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Jews in Spain. Are they even allowed to be in Spain? He actually mentions Britain. And he says, there are these debates in Britain right now about whether Jews have to take a special oath, etc. So he's very well informed in terms of the status of Jews in Europe at the time. And I think that, zooming out from the case of Hussein and the case of Tunisia, Hussein's argument about the rights of Jews as dhimmis is part of a broader effort among Muslim officials in North Africa to say that, yes, one might acknowledge that dhimmis and Muslims are judicially distinct, but that they have equal rights to justice before the law. And indeed, this is something that in Tunisia is enacted as part of the Ahd el-Aman, as part of a reform decree passed in 1857, which is sort of inspired by, although not at all a direct translation of the 1856 Ottoman decree, the Hati Humayun, which abolishes the status of dhimmi. So technically, there has been a kind of recognition of dhimmi's equal right to justice. And I would say that people like Hussein are trying to argue that this isn't something that is modern and this isn't, in fact, a new thing, but that Jews in Tunisia have always had the right to justice and they've always had equal access um, to the justice of the Bey. What's interesting is that this point gets made even more forcefully by not another Muslim, but by a Jew, a man named Eliyahu ben Avraham al-Maliach, or Leon el-Milek, as he wrote his name in Italian. El-Milek was originally from Algeria, but he had made his life in Tunisia, and he had basically convinced Hussein to hire him as a kind of intermediary. And he became very involved in the Shamama case and wrote his own briefs, which were printed in Hebrew, Italian, and French. I think he probably wrote them first in Hebrew, which is why I translate from the Hebrew. And in these briefs, he also says Jews and Muslims are equal before the law in Tunisia. Again, you could say, oh, well, El-Milek was just saying what Hussein wanted him to say. He was just copying Hussein. But he goes on and on about the rights of Jews in Tunisia, and he compares them to the rights of Jews in countries like Italy and France, where they have been fully emancipated, but where they have much less judicial freedom. Because he says, in France and in Italy, the Jews have to be subject to the same civil law as everybody else. But in Tunisia, we can choose. We can go to the rabbinic court. We can go to the Muslim courts. We can go to the consular courts, right? We have all of this kind of flexibility. So to recap a little bit, right? In trying to figure out, could Jews even be Tunisian? There are now at least two different legal briefs, one in Arabic written by Hussein and one in Hebrew written by El-Milek. And of course, they're both translated into French and Italian. And, sorry. And Pier Antoni, the Italian lawyer, who is the one who is actually going to argue the case before the judges, is tasked with trying to translate all of these, not literally translate, because they are published in Italian, but trying to make sense of all of these legal briefs according to Italian law. And what's interesting is that Pier Antoni, again, he doesn't really know anything about, he certainly doesn't know anything about Jewish law. He doesn't know anything about Islamic law or about Tunisian law. So he's really relying on El-Milek and Hussein to feed him the points that he's going to make. But he's not willing to echo either of their arguments that Jews and Muslims are equal before the law in Tunisia. Maybe he just thought it was too far-fetched, that no Italian judge would believe him. So instead, Pierantoni goes in a slightly different angle and he says, you don't need to be equal to be a national. Jews in Italy before the emancipation were not equal, right? They were not equals of Christians, but they were still subjects of the Duke of Tuscany or of the King of Sardinia or whatever it was. And so, so the fact that Jews weren't equal in Italy before emancipation and the fact that Jews aren't equal in Tunisia doesn't make any difference for their access to nationality. And that's why we should see Nissim Shamama as actually having been a Tunisian, that in fact, the inequality doesn't matter at all. Okay, I see that the hour is late, and of course I could go on and on because this is a subject that I'm extremely passionate about, but I do want to leave some time for discussion, so I'll sort of fast forward a little bit. At this point, I always feel like I probably shouldn't tell you what happens so that you'll all run out and buy the book, but that feels too cruel. So I will give you a little preview, at least, of what happens in the end with this case. So in 1883, there's a final ruling. 10 years after Nissim Shamama dies, the Court of Appeals in Florence and Firenze rules that Shamama did indeed die a Tunisian national. And what is perhaps most surprising is that Hussein's argument that Jews and Muslims are equal members of the Tunisian polity is repeated in the final ruling. What Pierantoni thought was so crazy that he wouldn't even repeat it, the Italian judges of the Court of Appeals who make the final call actually agree with. Now, though, starts a whole new kind of um, uh, part of the trial because now that they've determined that he died Tunisian, they have to figure out what Jewish law says about the will. And even though I said that it seemed very clear that according to Jewish law, the will was not kosher, of course, if you've ever met rabbis, right, they're very likely to disagree, and especially on points about Jewish law. And you can imagine, again, with so much at stake, there were a lot of different opinions about whether the will could be acceptable according to Jewish law. And this is where all of these rabbis weigh in from Jerusalem, Tunis, Cairo, Salonika, Algiers, Paris, and of course Livorno, and two of the kind of leading lights of Jewish thought. One man, Elia ben Amozeg, who is one of the most famous rabbis from Livorno from the 19th century, is sort of a philosopher and a Kabbalist, and wrote some very interesting and kind of crazy stuff about Judaism, I would say. And then another man who is much less well known, a man named David Castelli, who did not become a rabbi. He was on the path to become a rabbi. He actually studied with Ben Amozeg in Livorno, but then presumably had a kind of crisis of faith. So he became what else? A professor of Jewish studies. He went and studied in Pisa and then taught in Florence and wrote, articles for leading Jewish scholarly journals like the Jewish Quarterly Review, if you've heard of that, which is still around today, still published in America. Although at the time it was based in England. However, you can imagine that by this time, all of the potential heirs, Aziza, Mumu, Nathan, Joseph, they had all long ago run out of funds just to live their daily lives because they'd been paying these lawyers and they'd been waiting and waiting for the will. And of course, Joseph and Mumu and Nathan had all moved from Tunis to Livorno. Livorno was much more expensive than Tunis, and they had to keep up appearances. They all had their carriages and their servants. Joseph came with a large family and continued to have many children. So they were all in serious financial trouble. And when this man came around, a man named Émile d'Erlanger, who was a banker based between London and Paris, of German Jewish origin, although he himself was Christian. And he had known Nissim Shamama back when Nissim Shamama lived in Paris. He knew about Nissim's fortune, and he heard about Nissim's death. And so he sent a representative to Livorno who went around to each member of the family and got them each to sign an agreement saying in return for a relatively small sum compared to what they might get from the inheritance, they agreed to give up all of their rights in the inheritance to d'Erlanger. But then at least they had money in hand, right? So they started signing these agreements maybe 3 or 4 years after Nissim Shamama died, but still a good 5, 6, 7 years before the estate was finally paid out. So in the end, um, as you can see, lawyers and bankers are the only ones that actually get rich off of family disputes over estates. And so, of course, one of the lessons of the Shamama case is don't fight with your relatives over the estate. But no, but seriously, more broadly, and this is a story that for me was just absolutely fascinating to research. It involves this family that really isn't particularly well known, even though Nissim Shamama, as I said, was a very prominent figure during his lifetime. And it gets into all of these fascinating questions about where do Jews belong? Who are Jews? Do they fully belong to the countries in which they live? Are they their own nationality? What does it mean to become Tunisian or Italian? What does it mean to stop being Tunisian or Italian? And then in the last chapter, I trace some of the descendants of the Shamama family and look at how questions of nationality and citizenship continue to haunt them as they come to haunt Jews all over Europe in the 20th century, what my colleague Sarah Stein has called the calamitous 20th century, where, as you can imagine, some of the Shamama descendants end up suffering and being executed by Nazis for the fact of being Jewish, but also for the fact of not belonging to the states in which they live. So Shamamas in France get deported. Shamamas in Italy get put into prison camps where they don't die but suffer enormously and then die shortly after the war. So it's a very tragic ending, but it shows the extent to which these questions about belonging and nationality are by no means resolved in the 19th century, and continue to really have great weight and cause great suffering into the 20th. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. And as far as I'm concerned, I think we can move on to questions.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think, like a lot of us, my understanding of Tunis is more or less that's where red coral is exported from, and little more than that. Um, you didn't say when the case ended, because I think the French arrived in Tunisia in 1881. Did it
Yes.
end before that? And what was there an appeal, or probably nobody had any money left?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So that's right. France establishes a protectorate over Tunisia in 1881, and the case is not resolved finally until 1883. It seems like part of the reason that the Tunisian government and Erlanger were, um, sorry, I didn't mention this either, but Erlanger also comes to an agreement with the Tunisian government at the end to basically split the profits, right? So the Tunisian government gets about 28% and Derlanger gets 72%, um, which is their, so at that point, I think this is not something I looked into. You would not believe how many documents have survived from this case. It is unbelievable. And even though I wrote an entire book about it, there are many kind of small offshoots that I did not pursue. So this question of exactly how Derlanger and the Tunisian government came to an agreement, I didn't answer to my full satisfaction. My hunch is that the French authorities in Tunisia were basically like, yeah, we're gonna come to agreement with Derlanger, and then everybody will be happy, and we're not gonna pursue this case. There were a few people, including Al-Maliah, who was the most litigious to North African Jew I've ever met. This man he sued everybody. He sued Hussein. He sued the Tunisian government. He wanted to keep fighting the case. He wasn't satisfied with the ruling. But the Tunisian government, and I think behind them, the French colonial authorities basically said, we're done. So that's
Thank
how I
you.
see the French being involved, although it is actually, I think, something of an open question.
You slightly intimated about how Nissim made his money, but you weren't explicit. I mean, there must have been some business or something underlying.
Well, what we know, okay, so what's not clear is how much he made his money from basically skimming
Yeah.
off the top. What we know is that he was not a merchant, interestingly. That's not real. I mean, he was really a tax farmer. He started out as a kind of low-level tax farmer. Is this a familiar concept? Basically, the idea is that, right, you pay somebody to collect the taxes. And if they do a good job, they collect slightly more than whatever they paid for the privilege, but not so much more that everybody is ruined and they can't collect the taxes the next year. So Nissim was just very good at this. He was good at getting that sweet spot, and he made money from his first tax farm, and then he got bigger and bigger tax farms until he became the tax collector for the sort of head tax collector of the entire Tunisian state. He became what's called the receiver general.
Okay. And one last question from me. Which archives were you using, and particularly are there useful archives in Tunis that
Yeah.
can be accessed?
Yeah, so the heart of the story comes from the archives in Tunis. And that's really how I decided to write this book, because I'd heard about the case, I'd read some of the printed material, but I also heard through colleagues that there was a lot of stuff in Tunis, and I went there for a kind of initial archival rendezvous, and there were about 100 boxes of correspondence. I mean, unbelievably large amounts. Some of the boxes, were smaller, but some of them were quite big. I did not read every page. I mean, as I said, it's just endless amounts. So that's where most of it came from. But I also spent a lot of time in Italy, to get the Italian side of the story. Some archival research in French. And then I got a few sources, printed sources in particular, that were fairly rare from Israel, from the National Library there.
Great, thank you.
Oh, and the Ottoman archives. I also did go to Istanbul and found some important contextual stuff from the Ottoman archives.
Oh, excellent, brilliant. Tom,
Uh, yeah, I was also wondering how many languages you had to study. It must have been French, Arabic, I presume, Italian.
Yeah.
Mm.
And Hebrew, I mean, some of especially the halachic discussions is in Hebrew.
Mhm.
And then there is some stuff in Judeo-Arabic. There are a few teshuvot, a few responsa written in Judeo-Arabic. Um, the translation of the copy of his will, we don't have the original will, but we have the Judeo-Arabic and then a translation to Hebrew, but I wanted to read the original Judeo-Arabic. Um, and a little bit of Ottoman. My Ottoman is not excellent, but I was able to muddle through with the help of a research assistant.
Yes. Bruce Kahan has his hand up.
So this has been a wonderful law school class, Jessica, and really, as a lawyer, I so appreciate the fidelity of your research to the ins and outs of the legal jungle. And I wonder, following up on Tan's thought, how translating these legal concepts through languages, through spoken languages,
Mm.
lets us figure out what are comparable legal concepts and what are not. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and I won't belabor my own family story of being pillaged by Bank of America in their
Mm.
mishandling of our trusts, because I've written a law review article that recently came out on that. But what is it uh, that as Jews with our own nationality, what would we reestablish were we to think of it as a legal certainty in fiduciary law,
Mm.
in areas like trusteeship
Mm.
or bailment, or I don't want to get all legal
Mm.
wonky here, but
Mm.
what is it that we would draw on in that, or has it all been kind of diffused or infused into existing legal systems, and we don't have to claim it in that way?
Yeah, no, these are great questions. Well, okay, just so I don't forget, let me start with the translation question. And that is so much of the heart of the case too, is everybody's involved is having to translate across multiple languages, from Arabic to Hebrew to Italian to French. The Italian and French is a little bit easier because they're close Romance languages, and most of the time it's pretty clear. Although even that, you'd be surprised because there's also an enormous amount of instability in the legal terminology at the time, even within a language. So, for instance, the term nationality itself is actually quite new as we're using it in this case in the 19th century. So, nationality as a word exists from the early modern period. Nation, that's a very, very old word. But nationality as meaning your legal bond to a state, membership in a state, only actually comes about kind of early 19th century, right? And it's probably, this is my hunch, I don't even write it in the book, but I think it's coming from, they're sort of taking the model of a ship. Ships have a nationality in the early modern period, right? They get to put the flag up of their nationality, and they're taking that and kind of ascribing it to people, right? So everybody knows that a ship has to belong to a country, but there isn't really this clear sense that people have to belong to a country until starting in the 19th century. And then I was like, oh yeah, no, everybody has to have a nationality. But the difference between nationality and subjecthood or nationality and citizenship is unstable, and people disagree. Some people say nationality means full political and civil rights. Others say, no. Nationality is just the fact of being a member in the state, but you can be a sort of second-class national or a first-class national, right? And that's actually the cause for, I think, a lot of misunderstanding. But then in terms of translating from languages, right, that across different languages, especially from Romance languages to Semitic languages, is totally fascinating. And there are lots of different examples I could give, but because this is a Jewish genealogical society, I'll talk about the use of the word Am Yisrael, Ayin Mem. So Am is usually translated as like a people, but sometimes as a nation. And Leonel Milek, in his brief, right, I mentioned that he was very much he was a big proponent of the idea that Jews and Muslims in Tunisia are equal, but his real passion was to argue that Jews are a nationality. Jews are their own nation. And one of the things that he's constantly referring to are Jewish prayers, where we talk about Am Yisrael or Ha'amim, the peoples, right? And he says, look, this, we say it, and this is an old prayer, so we must be a nation. And then he says that, which, by the way, I mean, for anybody who, has ever looked at the Torah and tried to translate the concepts of the Torah into present day, right? It's not that simple. You can't just take a word and say, direct correlation. And then he does the same thing with Italian, because he says, look, over the Jewish cemetery in Livorno, it says Nazione Israelitica or Nazione Ebrea. So look, we must be a nation, right? They think of us as a nation. But of course, nation, as it was used also in the early modern period at the time when that sign was put up, did not mean the same thing that nation came to mean in the 19th century. So all of that also I find totally fascinating and I think, very telling of, I mean, every moment has an enormous amount of change, but for me, that's what makes the late 19th century so interesting. It was just so much uncertainty because there was so much change. Okay, I don't know if I can do justice to your second question, but it's an excellent one, and I think that, what's interesting about the case too is that you have really radically different interpretations of Jewish law, mainly around the will, but it comes down to the idea of, is Jewish law this kind of rigid set of rules that was written down in the Torah? I mean, it's pretty clear in the Torah that the closest male relatives and then the subsequent halachic literature, Mishnah, and then Shulchan Aruch is very, very clear. So, should we just apply that? Or do we take a more sort of interpretive approach? Because another strand within Jewish legal thinking is the idea that you also want to respect the wishes of the deceased. So if the deceased had clear wishes, even if he didn't maybe express them in the proper form, right? It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to respect those wishes. So here you have what seem to be very clearly competing imperatives. On the one hand, follow the letter of the law. On the other hand, respect the wishes of the deceased. Follow the letter of the law is only give the inheritance to his 3 living male relatives. Wishes of the deceased really seem to clearly say that he wanted to give money to Haziza, his basically daughter, even though he didn't have a legal relationship with her. And there, I think, so it's not a very satisfying answer, but I think that that's one of the things about Jewish law is that it's like any legal system, it leaves an enormous amount open for interpretation and debate. But perhaps that's a good thing, right? That's certainly what I find compelling about studying Judaism.
Kenna Herrick, thank you.
Bernard, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. It's absolutely fascinating, and it really raises so many questions. But I have a couple of questions which, again, relate to history and the law at that time. One is, were there Jews practicing law in all of the countries within whose jurisdiction this was at different times thought to fall? And if so, where had they studied? Did lawyers work across countries and nationalities, or did they have to work through national lawyers in the places that they were pleading? And since we are the Sephardic genealogy group, and we have descended through something that we call the Jewish, the Sephardic nation, was there any such concept as Sephardic law? And was that argued in any way? And if so, could you very briefly say something about that? Oh, just one other thing. I'm very interested in the role of medical schools in the emancipation of Jews. Did legal schools also have a similar role? I know that it was much later that Jews were allowed to practice in law, but I wonder.
Depends on the country, but yes, absolutely. These are excellent questions. Okay, I hope I'll keep them all in my head. So if I forget one, just please remind me. The first question is about Jewish lawyers. I don't, I should know the history of Jewish lawyers better in Italy. I know there were Italian Jewish lawyers, but I cannot think of one right now. And Italy and France were really the two most radical countries in 19th century Europe in terms of their emancipation. More, I will say, than England, even, although England eventually became sort of radical as well, but in the sense of no formal restrictions on what Jews could do after emancipation. Of course, France was before Italy. And definitely in France, you have some of the most famous Jewish figures of 19th century France were lawyers. And Adolphe Crémieux is the most famous. Crémieux of the Crémieux Decree, which was so important for Algerian Jews, right? Gave Algerian Jews French citizenship in 1870. But Crémieux himself was a practicing lawyer and occasional politician. And guess what? He was none other than Nissim Shamama's lawyer when Nissim Shamama lived in Paris. Because, of course, this is a tiny world of elite Jews. And, of course, Nissim Shamama is going to turn to the most famous Jewish lawyer in all of Europe at the time. So certainly, and I will refer you to the forthcoming book of my colleague David Sorkin, who's at Yale, who is writing precisely about the role of Jewish lawyers in fighting for Jewish rights in Europe and the Americas. And I've heard him give some talks, so he's better equipped than I am. But certainly, I would say that this is something that exists across the board. In Tunisia, the situation is a little different because before French colonization, neither Jewish law nor Islamic law has a traditional role for lawyers. Jewish law, if you go to a rabbinic court, now today people do hire lawyers, but traditionally that wasn't a thing, right? There's no kind of formal role for lawyers. Same as in Islamic law. In both cases, in Jewish law and Islamic law, you can appoint somebody with a power of attorney and say, look, but it's essentially a case of either I can't be there in person, right? Like there's a case pending in Tunis and I'm stuck in, I don't know, Sousse. So you represent me for the case. Or it's a case of essentially it's like a way of getting around the fact that you don't have lawyers. It's a case of you know the law better than me, so you represent me because I trust you. You're going to argue my case much better than I could argue it myself. And both Jews and Muslims do that in North Africa, respectively, before Jewish and Islamic courts, right? They'll essentially get somebody better informed than themselves, and they'll appoint that person as their attorney, as their power of attorney, with a power of attorney as their representative, and that person will argue the case. So that you certainly, but usually it's in my previous work on Morocco, right? I worked on this merchant named Yaakov Asaraf, and his father Shalom Asaraf, and both of them were frequently appointed as a kind of representative, actually even before the Islamic courts, mainly for other Jews, but sometimes also for Muslims. And in that case, you have to imagine that Shalom Asaraf had no formal legal training, nor did his son, but probably they were merchants who frequently had cases before the court, so they just got experience, and so they were better at doing that than most Jews who didn't go before the courts very frequently. So that was the kind of more like, could say, kind of traditional pre-colonial legal landscape. As soon as colonization hit, then you did have a lot of Tunisian Jews going and getting legal training in Europe. And in fact, I would say the first kind of wave of assimilationist Tunisian Jews and of like Italian Jews who really the Grana, the members of the Nassau, the Sephardic Jews who had come through Livorno and settled in Tunisia from way back, certainly from the 17th century and possibly even earlier. Many of them ended up in Italy, got legal training. Sometimes they came back to practice in Tunisia. Sometimes they stayed in Italy. And none other than Nissim Jr., Aziza's son, Nissim's adopted grandson, became a lawyer. He didn't stay in Italy. I suspect he was kind of fed up with Italy after the trauma of this 10-year lawsuit during which all of his family members were fighting. So he went to what became the preferred university for Tunisian Jews, the faculty of Aix-en-Provence, studied law there, become a very successful lawyer in Marseille, eventually moved to Paris, and really had a kind of dazzling legal career. Finally retired in the south of France, because why not? Died actually strangely shortly after the end of World War II. And that I don't know much about what he did during the war. I couldn't find much about that. I know he survived, but I don't know if he was fine or if he wasn't fine. In terms of Sephardic law, so yes, my email, I can do that. There absolutely were differences between Sephardic law and sort of indigenous North African law in the sense of minhag, right? None of this it was all under the branch of halacha, but there were different minhagim, there were different kind of strands, and there was a recognition that Sephardim had their own minhagim, which were different from the minhagim of autochthonous Jews. And this took slightly different forms in different places. So in Morocco, the minhagim of the autochthonous Jews had been largely kind of folded into the minhagim of the Sephardim because the Sephardim were so dominant. In Tunisia, the two communities remained quite separate and actually had separate organizations, right? So the Sephardic community, well, it's more confusing than that because the autochthonous community included some people who traced their ancestors through Spain, but did not think of themselves as part of the Nassau, as part of a nation. But then there were all of the Jews who traced their ancestry through Italy, and before that to Spain, who were who met, most of whom still had Spanish names, like Gutierrez, like Diaz, like Santillana, Lombroso, and they had a very strong Sephardic identity, and then later in the 19th century came to take on a very strong Italian identity. And that's something actually that I'd like to write about eventually, because I don't think it's well understood. They're often just called Italian, but I think that's really a misnomer because, first of all, they're not using Italian as a language. When they first come to Tunisia, they're still using Spanish or sometimes Portuguese. And then eventually they start using Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, like the Tunisian Jews. Of course, they're also always using Hebrew. And only in the 19th century did they start really using Italian and getting Italian nationality and identifying it Italian. And then they become the most Italian of the Italians, and they found the Italian hospitals and the Italian schools and the Italian Chamber of Commerce, right? They become more Italian than the Italians because, of course, they're Jews too, right? So in order to prove your Italianness, you have to go the extra mile to show the Catholic Italians that you're really Italian.
And just the other question about practice across borders. Was there such a thing as an international lawyer, or did people take local lawyers and work with them or commission them on their behalves?
Right. No, exactly. That's right. That's a good question. So I would say that, you know, even though international law is sort of born in this period, actual lawsuits always get worked out in the context of a national court, because there's no such thing as an international court yet. That comes well after, you know, well into the 20th century. So it does happen that you will have a lawyer argue cases across national boundaries. And actually, a Tunisian Jewish lawyer from Livorno, a man named David Santillana, becomes one such lawyer. So he is born in Tunisia, actually studies in London, does his undergraduate work in London, but doesn't stay for reasons that are unclear. He wanted to get English nationality and didn't succeed, and I think that kind of discouraged him. He goes back to Tunis, works with his father in Tunis for a bit, then goes to Italy and becomes a lawyer in Italy. And that's kind of where he makes his career, but he goes back after he becomes a lawyer and works for the Bey of Tunis. Then at some point he works for the Khedive, the kind of viceroy of Egypt, on a case. Then he goes back and is sent by the French to like write a report in Tunisia, and eventually is actually assigned the role of writing the first draft of the Civil Code of Tunisia, which is published in 1906. And he's sort of best known for that. Then he gets sent to Italy on behalf of the Italian government. So he is an extremely international figure, but I would say that's unusual. That actually most lawyers, and you know, including Jewish lawyers, mostly plead in their country, even if their thinking might be about international law. So somebody like Mancini, as far as I know, he never ever pled a case outside of Italy. Same with Pierantoni, even though they had a super international profile. Pierantoni later also became the president of the Institut du Droit International, right? They were really very well known, but not like today. Most people aren't equipped to plead in a foreign court, you know? Ask an American lawyer, my God. That's never.
Thank you. Brilliant answers, and thank you so much. I'll have to get.
Great questions.
Can I throw in one more question? Why
Yes.
why did Nissim write his will in Judeo-Arabic? Seems
That
quite an
was
unusual
almost
choice.
certainly the only language he was literate in, the only language that he could write in. He spoke Judeo-Arabic. As far as we know, he never learned any other language. And I have letters. I mean, I've consulted extensive correspondence from him addressed Nissim Shamama, you know, signed by him to his superiors in the Tunisian government, which are all written in Arabic, but certainly he had a secretary who wrote them because all of the signatures are in Hebrew. So the only thing that he penned is always in Hebrew letters. And this was absolutely common for North African Jews. The vast majority of North African Jews, unless you were a rabbi, in which case, you know, unless you had the education of a rabbi, in which case you might have been able to compose in Hebrew. Otherwise, the only language that you could actually compose in would have been Judeo-Arabic. And then there were a few exceptions, but you know, what Nissim Shamama was born before the Alliance existed in Tunisia. The Alliance had just been created, Alliance Israélite Universelle, which spread French to Jews all over. There was one Italian school which had a few Jewish students in Tunisia before Nissim Shamama died, but he wasn't a Grana, right? He wasn't a member of the Livornese community, so he wouldn't have had any. And anyway, he was too old. I mean, he was too old to go to that school. Maybe he could have sent a kid there, but that would have been weird for him because he wasn't Italian. So really, there was no way to learn other languages at this time. There were a few exceptional Jews who somehow did manage to learn French or English or Italian, and often became the interpreters for consulates, right? Jews were way overrepresented in North Africa as interpreters for consulates, but we don't really know much how they learned those languages. It's a big mystery, actually, except that from their parents. But then how did their parent learn it, right? Somebody had to learn it first. And you know, that is part of the story of Jews' kind of multilingualism and ability to have these networks across borders. But it's still it's fascinating, and also fascinating to think about somebody as wealthy and powerful as Nissim Shamama, whose only literacy was in Judeo-Arabic. It's kind of amazing.
Thank you. Tom.
I was wondering about the concept of Nassau. The Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam called themselves the Nassau Hebraica, or the Portuguese nation. And they were kind of a state within the state, or in this case, a state within the city of Amsterdam, which also had its own laws apart from the Republic, which also had its laws. So it's a complicated situation. But they were allowed to raise their own taxes. They were allowed to discipline their own members. They could levy fines. They could exclude someone from the communities. They could not administer capital punishment, or they could not whip somebody into obedience or something like that. But otherwise, it was a close-knit community within the community. Was it like that in Livorno?
Livorno had a very similar structure. They called themselves the Nazione, the nation, which is just the Italian translation of Nassau, and had you know, a significant degree of autonomy. They had what this is something that I'll put her name in the if you haven't already invited her, I would highly recommend it. Professor Evelyne Ollier-Crouch, who is a professor here at the Sorbonne, but she's perfectly bilingual and speaks perfect English. And she's the main expert on the legal history of Jews in Livorno in the early modern period. So she can say much more than I, but what's distinctive about the Livornese community, which as far as I know did not exist anywhere else in the Sephardic world, is that in addition to the autonomy that allowed them to have their own rabbinical court, they also had a court that was kind of what we would consider sort of a secular court run by the Masari, who were not rabbis, but rather kind of leading lay people who were elected sort of, you know, by limited suffrage, and who decided who could become a member of the nation, which was very important in Livorno because unlike almost anywhere else in the Jewish world, if you got ballotazione, if you got basically membership in the Jewish community in the Jewish nation of Livorno, you were a full citizen of the state of Tuscany, which is really incredible and was part of why the Livornese Jewish community was such a powerhouse, because they had these really unprecedented and unequaled rights. In North Africa, you had, in some ways, a very similar situation where you had a kind of Jewish community with a lot of autonomy, but I would say the difference is that they had even more autonomy. So I don't know if this is true for Tunis, but in much of North Africa, and certainly in places like Morocco, like Fez, and it's probably true for Tunis, although it's not very well documented, Jews had the right to their own prison. They could imprison their own community members. They could administer physical punishment, not the death penalty. That was supposed to be reserved for the local authorities. But you could whip people, you could give people the bastonado, as well as fine people or just stick them in prison. And that, that was in addition, of course, to levying their own taxes and administering Jewish courts. So there was really a very robust degree of self-policing that Jews were able to do. And that I think, it's not that different from what goes on in Amsterdam, but I think it's just slightly more, right? The volume is slightly turned up and that's something that's really across the Mediterranean, like Salonika also had a Jewish prison. Oh, although somebody told me that Prague also had a Jewish prison, so it's not necessarily limited to the Islamic world. In fact, somebody should write a book on Jewish prisons in the early modern period because it's really interesting and it's shocking that it hasn't been written, right? We should know about the history of how Jews imprisoned other Jews. I think it's really fascinating.
It is.
Right,
There's,
yes, so the Mahmad in London, exactly, right. So that's right. So the Masari are not completely sui generis. They're not the only ones. However, as far as I know, they are the only ones who have the power of giving citizenship to Jews. They're essentially,
Mhm.
it's amazing, actually, in that sense. Of course, citizenship meant something different. It was really citizenship in the city. But anyway, yes, it's still pretty incredible.
In Amsterdam, you had to buy citizenship, but then it was a lower
Right,
form of citizenship, and it was not to be inherited by your
right.
children.
Right. And in France, Jews were regularly denied
Mm,
formal citizenship, even after they were kind of more or less tolerated. The Jews of Bayonne or Bordeaux, the Sephardic communities there. I just was looking at some fascinating correspondence in Istanbul, where a Jewish doctor, um, is trying to get his brother out of a enslavement. His brother has been captured on a ship, maybe in
mm,
Malta, as a part of the corsairing sort of economy. And he goes to the French ambassador and he says, "Please get my brother out." And the French ambassador kind of looks into the case and says, "Well, I'd love to, but your brother isn't a French citizen. He tried to get French citizenship. He went to Paris, but the king said no because you're Jewish. So I can't really do much for you." Anyway.
yes. I know of one Jew who got the full Amsterdam citizenship, but that was after he converted.
Ah,
But his
yes, right.
children converted back to Judaism and were still able to claim citizenship, full citizenship.
Oh, interesting.
That's the only
That's fascinating.
case
That's
that
a
I
good
know.
that's a good trick.
Yeah, it was. Um, Booth has posted the link to
Yes,
an
thank you.
article you wrote.
Yes.
And there was one question in the chat that hasn't been addressed yet.
Okay.
It's about the genealogy of the family. Was Aziza's husband, Moses Shamama, related to Nissim? And if so, how was he related? And would he have also had a claim?
Excellent, excellent question. He was distantly related. I don't know exactly how. And the Cercle de Généalogie Juive here in France is very active and some of the genealogists that belong to that community have done really amazing work on the Shamama family, on which I relied immensely, and I'm incredibly grateful. Um, and but they couldn't figure it out. So if they can't figure it out, I definitely am not going to be able to. The Shamama is not such an unusual name in Tunisia. It's not like the most common name, but there are a lot of Shamamas. So it's the records are very spotty. So it is surely they were related somehow, but not directly related, probably a distant cousin. And Moshe Shamama, so he wouldn't have had a direct claim on the estate, but of course he was very involved in his wife's claim, um, and he was usually the one to actually go to court. Aziza usually stayed home and gave him power of attorney, but I imagine that the two of them were certainly talking about strategy, I think. I like to think that Aziza was involved since it was, after all, her uncle.
And what happened
And
eventually to
yeah, what happened to Aziza? So Aziza and Moshe follow their son, Nissim Jr., who has moved to Marseille. And first they live with him in Marseille, and then they move with him to Paris, where they are buried. So now they're here in the Cimetière de Montparnasse. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, in some ways, I think they probably also wanted to leave behind the whole thing, but Nissim Jr. couldn't totally because, of course, first of all, he became a lawyer, right? He took the good lesson. He said, "Aha, the only people who win in this world are lawyers." So he became one. And then, of course, he wrote his dissertation about international private law, and ended up becoming very involved in the group of Italians in France, and became a very early advocate for dual nationality. Because one of the things that I haven't sort of maybe made explicit, and perhaps you know this, but until certainly in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the vast majority of states did not accept dual nationality. You had to choose. You were one or the other. And Nissim Shamama Jr. said, that's ridiculous. People should be allowed to have two nationalities because some people feel very attached to two different states. Like me, he had become a French citizen, but he also felt very attached to Italy, and he wanted to. Interestingly, he never says anything about Tunisia. He'd also kind of left behind the Tunisian thing, and in fact, his first marriage, short-lived, is to a distant cousin who also has the name Shamama. They divorce, and then he marries an Ashkenazi Jewish woman, who I think perhaps was much more French than his Tunisian background. So, you know, in that sense, yeah, and I wish I knew more about Aziza. She was somebody who I, you know, would have liked to write a whole book about, and I couldn't find as much information as I had wanted to, but she's also a fascinating character. And I find her story just, I mean, yeah, amazing.
Thank you. David?
Nothing more to say except thank you. That was a complete tour de force. I'm sorry that the Cercle de Généalogie Juive in France is having their AGM today, so that's why people from there couldn't join us. But I'm sure they'll watch the video when it's published. And yeah, we very much hope that you'll come and speak to us again. That was
Oh, with great pleasure. Yes, yes, absolutely. And please do stay in touch. So I put my email, but you should be able to find me.
Yeah.
And if you want to get the book, it just came out in paperback. So hopefully that makes it a little more
Brilliant.
accessible.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tan. Thank you, everybody who
So
asked
Tom,
questions, especially.
would you
Thank
like
you
to
all for
close the
coming.
meeting?
This was Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we thank our patrons, without whom there will be no Sephardic World. And a big thank you to Jessica for a brilliant presentation. And we hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.